The golden age of America begins right now. My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day, and the day that we began to make America wealthy again. Let's be honest. The European Union was formed in order to screw the United States. That's the purpose of it. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. Right now, you don't. You're playing cards. You're gambling with World War III. I don't want to be cute. I don't want to be a wise guy, but the Riviera of the Middle East, this could be something that could be so bad. This could be so magnificent. Very anti-Semitic when you take a look, whether it's Columbia, Harvard, Princeton. I don't know what's going on. We need Greenland for national security and even international security. And I think we're going to get it. One way or the other, we're going to get it.
US President Donald Trump was elected on a platform of making America great again, and making the rest of the world pay their respects and their tariffs. In just 3 months, he threatened to annex Gaza, Greenland, the Panama Canal, and Canada. He promised to bring peace to Europe and the Middle East, though both regions now appear more uncertain than ever. Under his watch, hundreds of migrants, some with legal status in the US, were arrested and deported to prison camps in El Salvador. At least 4 pro-Palestinian students are now in detention, including green card holders Mahmoud Khalil and Mohsen Mahdawi. Thousands of others have had their visas revoked or live in fear that they'll be targeted by masked ICE agents for taking part in protests. Trump tore up DEI initiatives and bullied Ivy League schools into letting his administration take control of their campuses and their curriculums. Now he's being sued by Harvard, the world's richest university. Meanwhile, his political partner and financier Elon Musk is bulldozing his way inside the government. His Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, fired hundreds of thousands of public sector workers, downsizing the departments of education, the environment, tax, and social services. Not to mention gutting USAID, denying billions in foreign aid to dozens of developing countries, NGOs, and human rights organizations. And then came the tariffs. First targeting the US's strongest trade partners, Canada and Mexico, then the rest of the world. They sent the stock market into a tailspin and made some of Trump's friends billions of dollars when they were suddenly reversed. The White House says it's all part of an elaborate strategy to reform global trade and claw back manufacturing jobs from China. But what we're now faced with is a full-on trade war between the world's 2 biggest economies, threatening global recession and rewriting political and economic alliances around the world. In his first term in office, what held Trump back was his own party, his own cabinet, formed from technocrats like oil magnate Rex Tillerson and lifelong Republicans like his VP Mike Pence. He then fired Tillerson and looked the other way when his most fevered supporters threatened to kill Pence as they stormed Capitol Hill in an attempt to overturn a Democratic election in 2020. This time, though, there is no one standing up to Trump. He's surrounded by people praising his every move, applauding him in every room he steps into. His former political rivals like Marco Rubio have bent the knee and been rewarded for it. The judges that have tried to keep him in check have either been ignored or arrested. His party has been reshaped in his image, and MAGA is now a political storm that will dominate the Republicans and the country for generations. Trump wants to fundamentally redefine the US and its role in the world. So how has the world responded? To break it down for us, we're joined now live from Athens by MEE political reporter Sean Matthews. Sean, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me on, Mo. It's a pleasure to join you.
Now, Trump campaigned on being a peacemaker. He said he was going to end all wars, and he promised especially to resolve the situation in Ukraine and Gaza. How is that going so far?
Yeah, I think he's gotten smacked by the geopolitical realities, probably both domestic and international with both wars. We should separate Gaza and Ukraine, but let's take Ukraine at first, right? Trump set himself a high bar with Ukraine. He said he would end the war in 1 day upon taking office, so we're at 100 days. No deal has been sealed. I mean, you played those clips when I joined earlier, kind of about Trump's 100 days, and we heard the browbeating of Zelensky in the White House, that famous line where he says, you have no cards. A lot of supporters of Ukraine believe that Trump has been obviously harder on Ukraine than he has been on Russia, Russia being the United States' historic geopolitical foe, both in the Middle East and in Europe. I mean, he's failed at that. I think with Ukraine, the big hiccup here is that Trump really has to ask himself whether Putin wants to end the war or not. Trump came out and he gave into some of Putin's key demands actually already, which a lot of critics of Trump have said kind of played into Russia, right? He said that Ukraine was going to be off the table from joining NATO. He says now that he wants to recognize Russia's annexation of Crimea, something that European states and even Turkey, a NATO member, are opposed to. So, he's given some big cards to Russia, and a lot of people are starting to say that he's gotten nothing in return. Trump had a big meeting with Zelensky at the Vatican during the Pope Francis's funeral. And around that time, Trump has started to up his criticism of Russia a little bit more. He said he was very disappointed in Putin for the missile strikes that were taking place in Kyiv. Very rare to hear Trump speak at all, whether in the Middle East or in Europe, about civilian casualties. Doesn't matter who they are. It's probably one of the first times he's actually mentioned civilian casualties. So that was kind of seen as a sign of Trump's growing frustration with the Russians. But in general, I think that this Ukraine deal is it's stuck. The big hallmark, which Trump wanted to have done within his 100 days for sure, was this mineral deal, where Ukraine and the U.S. would agree to a joint fund to invest in strategic minerals, resources in Ukraine. Trump said that would give the Ukrainians, security guarantees because there'd be American investors on the ground, American workers. And Trump hasn't even been able to get that deal done. Now, this week, we've heard rumors that the deal could be sealed by this week. So I think in European capitals and in Washington, everyone is watching that. On the Middle East front, I think it's even more of a bad score for Trump. The Gaza war is raging, and Trump has pretty much let it go unchecked. Before he came into office in January, he made a big push to get a ceasefire sealed for his inauguration. And he very much wanted the optics of being a deal maker at that time on January 20th, to have the images of the guns going silent in Israel, and probably most importantly for Trump, hostages being taken out of Gaza and sent back to Israel, even to Europe and the US. And he got that deal done. Once the initial exchange was over, Trump basically gave Netanyahu a green light to go back into Gaza and to restart his war. And that's where we're at today. I would say this: everyone is focusing on Gaza and Ukraine, but I was listening to your headlines earlier, and not only has Trump failed to end those two wars, but he has got America into another conflict in Yemen in his 100 days. So we have daily bombing campaigns from U.S. warplanes over Yemen as the U.S. tries to wrest back control of the Red Sea. Its claim to stop Houthi attacks there. So I think he's 0 for 2, and he's actually batting a negative in terms of ending the wars.
And let's get to the Middle East in a second, but going back to Europe and this relationship that Europe has enjoyed with the U.S. for a very long time under the NATO agreement, which was this bulwark designed to keep Russia at bay, Europe was able to shift its focus away from militarization and towards progressive economic policies that a lot of European countries, are the envy of the world. And in exchange, it had this promise from the U.S. that if any military aggression, specifically from Russia, would come into place, then the U.S. would come and protect them. And we saw that under Biden when the Ukraine war started. But now we're seeing this very, very dramatic shift under Trump. What is happening to Europe? How is it reacting to this sudden antagonism that they're seeing from their once ally in the U.S.?
Yeah, Mo, it's really fascinating to see, especially on the periphery of Europe, in Eastern Europe, in the Balkans. You really see these countries, I guess, becoming more aware that they're a part of Eurasia, right? And that they can no longer rely on this American Western security umbrella. Europe wanted guns. The argument has always been guns or butter, and Europe took the butter and it left the guns to the U.S. So now Europe is rearming. We're seeing this push from countries like Germany, to reinvest in their armaments industry, even to repurpose factories that were geared towards automotive vehicles into weapons factories. As Germany kind of loses out in China with the vehicle race. So there's a lot of talk about manufacturing weapons in Europe. It remains to be seen whether the Europeans have the capabilities to do that, because they're constrained by, first, labor shortages, aging populations, high energy costs, massively more expensive than the U.S., and it takes a lot of energy to manufacture weapons and missiles. So I think the Europeans are struggling with rearmament, but they are committing themselves to that. We saw Spain, which has always been a laggard in NATO spending, come out and say it was going to reach 2% of defense spending. But the really big pushes have been in Eastern Europe and in Southern Europe, Southeastern Europe, I would say, where countries are more proximate to age-old foes. In Greece's case, Turkey. In the case of Poland, Russia. These countries are really leading the pack in investing more in defense, going above the 2% kind of metrics of their GDPs that NATO requires them to invest. They're at 4%, 3%, and they're going to go higher. So there is a rearmament push going on. And I think Europe basically faces a conundrum, right? Which is that either you raise taxes to keep sustaining a welfare state and military spending, or you cut the welfare state and don't raise taxes. And that's the problem that Europe faces right now. I would say this, though, before we get to the U.S., it is interesting, you talked about mega movement. The idea in Europe that is gaining some traction is that, as the U.S. kind of fractures, that we could see a mega movement, which is make Europe great again. That's the rhetoric that some Europeans use. Because we're seeing kind of some liberally minded Americans want to move to Europe to escape Trump and this kind of stuff. But it's the defense spending, and it's this idea that Europe could be more of a haven of stability. We've seen the euro rising against the dollar, so there's a lot of talk in the geoeconomic sphere that Europe might replace the U.S. dollar system. That's another conversation. But there is a trend where you see Europe coalescing a bit. I would just say this. I think that the most interesting trend for the Middle East is there are two countries that are perhaps best placed to benefit from this European drive of an American vacuum being left. One is Turkey, which has the largest military standing army in NATO. It's a huge defense manufacturer, obviously, in drones. We've reported on this for many years. It's a great story that Middle East Eye has been on top of. Then the other story, despite the war that is raging in Gaza, is Israel. And Israel is looking to increase co-production and joint production with specific countries in Eastern Europe where it has alliances. I'm thinking about Greece as one, but also I would look for Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. These countries have cheap labor costs. They are spending high amounts of their GDP on defense, and they're looking to buy Israeli products, which is a very interesting trend. At the same time that Israel is taking money from the U.S., of course, the military aid.
Now, speaking of armament, another massive project for Trump right now seems to be getting a new Iran nuclear deal on the table. And of course, back in his first term, he was the one that walked away from that initial nuclear deal that was organized under the Obama administration that allowed Iran to escape some of the brutal sanctions that had crippled its economy. Now there's this back and forth happening between Trump and Iran. The language itself is really interesting because Trump seems to be saying that we can get this deal done. We don't have to escalate. But at the same time, I have this military solution on the table. And this is a military solution that some of the strongest people in his ear really want to explore. What do you think is at stake here with these talks that have already started between the U.S. and Iran?
Yeah, Look, Mo, I would say this. During the campaign in November when we were covering this race, there were three open files that Trump had to address in foreign policy. One was Ukraine, the other was Gaza, and then the other was this Iranian nuclear deal. I think the irony for Trump is that the Ukrainians, which are receiving all this American weaponry aid, and Putin, which Trump has this fondness for, they're not delivering for Trump. Israel, America's closest ally, is not going to deliver on ending the war in Gaza. It is actually Iran that might deliver for Trump the deal that he needs to show that he is a deal maker and that he can get something done. And it's ironic because if you remember, as you said, in Trump's first term, he really cracked down on Iran. He assassinated Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the IRGC Quds Force. He ramped up this maximum pressure campaign. But with the Iranians, from our reporting and from sources we speak with, diplomats in the region, analysts, even U.S. officials, there is a sense that Iran desperately wants a deal. Its economy is not doing well. There's a lot of pressure from Gulf states for there to be a deal. I think this is very important, and we should emphasize this more. that Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, they desperately want to see a deal between the U.S. and Iran. Israel doesn't, but these countries do. We saw the Saudi Defense Minister Khalid bin Salman, MBS's brother, going to Iran this month. That was a very big visit. So I think Trump could potentially get a deal with Iran. The problem is that Trump's team is divided in two, and I think this is what people have to understand. There is the traditional hawkish kind of Republican wing represented by guys like Marco Rubio, also, Mike Waltz, his national security advisor, and they are very hard on Iran, right? These are your traditional Republicans, right? When you think of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, that's who you think of. At the other side, you have isolationist, American first Republicans who are extremely reluctant to enter a conflict with Iran, and they have been really increasing their voice, demanding a deal with Iran. Within the administration, that's represented by J.D. Vance, the vice president. Vance took a lot of heat for browbeating Zelensky in the Oval Office. But Vance consistently is showing up as this guy who is the most isolationist in Trump's wing. He opposed the strikes in Yemen during the Signalgate chat. Everyone had visibility into that. Vance kind of arguing that this, striking the Houthis in Yemen was not in keeping with Trump's kind of campaign in November of America First. I don't think he did it because he cared about Yemen, but at least for his perspective and his worldview, he wanted to see the U.S. kind of pulling back from entanglements. So he is a big voice for a deal. Tulsi Gabbard, also Trump's director of national intelligence, she came out at a Senate hearing and she very firmly said that the U.S. intelligence community assesses that Iran has not decided to make a nuclear weapon. And that was a very big statement from her because it gave a lot of ammunition to Trump allies in the media to come out and say, look, our own intelligence community is saying that Iran has not decided to build a nuclear bomb. They have not crossed that threshold. They're not even contemplating it yet. So don't underestimate that statement also from Gabbard. So Trump has these two wings pulling at him, right, at the same time. And I think a lot of people think that Trump is probably leaning towards the isolationist America First view. We did a piece yesterday for Middle East Eye discussing kind of the conservative podcasters who are really, really hammering the need for a deal. Tucker Carlson is the main one, who has really unfettered access to the Trump administration. He has, almost every month he has had a different podcast on talking about why a war with Iran would be a disaster for the U.S. And yesterday Trump came out and said he thought he could get a deal with Iran. I know we want to talk about Trump's visit also, but I would say this. I think a hallmark to look for, let's see what happens in middle of May when Trump goes to the region. Because I think Trump very, very much would like to unveil a nuclear deal then. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I think the Iranians have serious reservations about working with Trump, whether they can trust them or not. As you said, right, Trump unilaterally withdrew from the 2015 nuclear deal. But I think that out of the three kind of conflicts that we've discussed, that these files that are raging, Gaza, Ukraine, and Iran, it's actually with Iran that Trump probably has the best chance of striking a deal.
Well, let's end our conversation on this upcoming Trump visit to the Middle East. Of course, as you rightly mentioned, I'm sure that he will want to land with a red carpet rolled in front of him as this peacemaker that's going into the region and bringing it together. But looking at the policies, and when it comes to tariffs, when it comes to his policy in Gaza, when it comes to the way that he's handled that situation, those negotiations between several of the countries that are involved in the hostage negotiations in Gaza with Hamas, for example, is Trump going to land in the Middle East as this peacemaker, as somebody that, in his first term was embraced by a lot of the leaders in the region, or is he landing as somebody that has caused a lot of these same leaders more headaches than they had bargained for?
Well, I guess it depends where he's landing, Mo. I mean, he's going to three countries, at least publicly, right? Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE. I think in the UAE, he's going to get a warm reception. The UAE has really doubled down on its partnership with Israel through the Abraham Accords. They've kind of ignored, they just want to wish away the war in Gaza. That is what the UAE wants. We've even reported ourselves that the UAE has been lobbying the Trump administration not to agree to an Arab League plan for the post-war reconstruction of Gaza. So I think in the UAE, Trump will probably have a fine welcome. In Qatar, I think, Trump's a deal maker, and he's very, he is comfortable, kind of working with the Qataris. Steve Witkoff, his envoy, has been full of praise for Qatar's role as an envoy in the Gaza negotiations. But I really think the big country here, Mo, that we have to watch, it's Saudi Arabia, obviously. I mean, this is the big one. What Trump desperately wants is to expand the Abraham Accords, which he considers the hallmark of his presidency, his first term, and he needs Saudi Arabia to do that. Trump might not care about the war in Gaza, but Mohammed bin Salman has to care about the war in Gaza because his people very much care about the war. And the Crown Prince has publicly said that Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza. So Trump's main mission during his trip to the region, after nuclear deal with Iran, if he wants it, is the Abraham Accords. And it's to convince Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to normalize ties with Israel. I suspect, and diplomats that I speak with in the region, U.S. analysts, officials, everyone is very, very skeptical that the Crown Prince is going to make a normalization deal while a war is raging in Gaza, and most of the Arab and Muslim world considers a genocide is going on. So I think he's got his work cut out for him in Saudi Arabia.
Sean Matthews, it's a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks, Mohammed.